The mirror showed Dominic reflections that weren't his own. The mirror was an oddity, but an oddity that he would come to rely on. The hell is this thing? Dominic had been browsing for things he could sell at his local thrift store, and the mirror had caught his eye. It stood out because this shop didn't usually put trash out with their junk. The mirror was fractured in 7 places, and it looked like someone had punched it in the center and sent spider cracks through the glass. At first he thought it was some kind of joke mirror, because when he looked at it, he saw 7 different reflections, and only 2 of them were his. The 2 that were him were on the top right and the bottom left. The left one showed a much younger Dominic as he shuddered on a metal frame bed in Clarence County Prison. At first, he thought it was just some inmate. Everyone kind of looked the same with a bald head and stripes on. But he would never forget that cell. It had the swastikas carved on the wall behind it, the legend that stated "cops are bastards" below it, and the picture of his then wife that he had stuck up with toothpaste to add some color to the cell. It was him all right, but the one across from it was much more interesting. The top right showed Dominic picking up a painting in the art section, a painting with a price tag on it that read $2,000 in your pocket. Dominic was no fool. He wanted to make sure this wasn't some kind of weird trick first. He'd grown up in gangs and living rough, and he knew a hustle when he saw one. It was an impressive hustle, to be sure, but it still smelled like a hustle to him. Dominic went to the little section they had for art, and sure enough, there was a weird picture of women sitting on a balcony, their faces seeming to grin and scream all at once. The price tag on the front was not for $2,000, however, and was for a much more reasonable $10. Dominic thought it over, pulling out his phone as he snapped a picture, and looked to see what it was worth. He found a page for some artist named Roland DePriest, and it just so happened that a lot of his paintings were going for big bucks since he'd recently offed himself. A quick look told Dominic that this was indeed a DePriest, and the going price for it was about $2,000 as of this afternoon. He picked up the painting and the mirror, deciding to take both home with him. "What you want that ratty old mirror for?" asked Mr. Drussel, looking at the broken glass without much interest. Clearly, he couldn't see what Dominic saw in it, and that might be for the better. "I like the frame," Dominic lied. "Think I might use it for something." Mr. Drussel looked at the painting in a precursory way, but shrugged as he tapped it all up on his calculator. $10, he said, holding his wrinkly hand out with expectation. Mr. Drussel did business in cash, and did not truck with the little plastic card machines. "What about the mirror?" Dominic asked, not wanting to get scammed after the fact. Take it. I can't sell a broken mirror, and the frame looks ugly anyway. If you want it, then by all means, take it off my hands. Just don't cut yourself on the glass. I'd hate for you to try to sue me after I gave you such a great deal on it." Dominic nodded, thanking Mr. Drussel as he left the little shop, with a tinkle of the bell overhead. The painting sold for the proposed $2,000 to a scalper friend of his, and the mirror Dominic hung in his bedroom. For a week, the mirror did little more than show him going about mundane tasks, and Dominic began to wonder if he really had been had. The little inmate still stayed in his cell, sometimes going out for chow, but mostly just staying and looking sad. That tracked, Dominic had spent a lot of his time being sad about one thing or another. Sad that he was stuck in prison for 5 years at first, then sad that his wife had left him towards the end. He tried to figure out what the other spots meant, but they were kind of mysterious. The middle 2 showed awful things he didn't like to think about. He was a tough guy. He'd been in his fair share of scrapes and seen people get killed in his lifetime, but this stuff was so much worse. People beating kids, people killing their wives, people hurting animals, and everything in between. The one next to it wasn't much better. He could see mothers tucking in starving kids, homeless people crying as they used the last of their money for a bottle of cheap alcohol, even little kids huddled together as they hid from someone. Some of what that mirror showed him was terrible, but some of it was as helpful as the painting had been. The top left panel showed a woman he knew all too well as she went about her daily life. He should know her. She was his ex-wife. The bitch had divorced him while he was in prison and took most of his stuff while he was too incarcerated to do anything about it. She had taken advantage of him while he was at his lowest, and for that, he hated her. In that respect, he thought of that tab as his eternal enemy, and even wrote it on a post-it note and stuck it to the wall. The mirror turned out to be useful when it came to avoiding her, proving itself one day just as he was about to leave. He was going out on a date, his hair freshly cut and his cologne not too heavy, when someone knocked on the door. His date was supposed to meet him at the restaurant, but he thought maybe she'd come to pick him up instead, and came out of the bathroom towards the front of the house. He was walking past the mirror when he suddenly saw his ex standing outside a very familiar door. She did this sort of thing sometimes, especially if she could Facebook stalk enough information to realize he was serious about someone. He hid out, letting her knock for a while longer, but she finally got bored and left. Dominic was only a few minutes late for his date, and used this little peephole often so he could avoid running into his ex. On the other hand, the bottom right panel showed him an older man he had never met before. Watching that guy was like watching lifestyles of the rich and famous. He ate expensive food, drove expensive cars, wore expensive clothes, and went to bed with somebody new every time Dominic noticed. He decided to leave that label blank for now, not really sure what he was seeing or how it would come to affect him. He found that on days when he didn't have anything better to do, he was checking the mirror to see what he could see. Dominic had definitely found some windfalls from the mirror. The 3 scratch-offs he'd won kept his rent paid, but he was looking for another big score like the painting. On the top right, Dominic was back at the thrift store, but it was a different one today. Dominic watched as he picked up an expensive-looking fur coat, putting it on as he preened a little in front of the mirror. Then, he stuck his hand in the pocket and pulled out a diamond watch that, even to an untrained eye like Dominic's, looked expensive. The thrift store was known to him, a little second-hand store on Mulbank, and after checking that his ex was still at her job, he decided to go see if lightning would strike twice. The thrift store wasn't crowded, and the coat was loud enough to be seen from the entrance. Dominic assumed that it would reek of liquor and cheap cigars, looking like some wannabe pimp's prop, but the coat was in immaculate condition. The tag said it was a Vanderfur, a brand even Dominic was familiar with. He put it on and went to the mirror, preening a little as he'd seen himself do. The coat looked good, very good in fact, and it would go well with some of the shoes he had at home. As he stuck his hand into the pocket, however, it was time for the moment of truth. At first there was nothing. Then suddenly, his fingers touched the harsh surface of an expensive watch. Dominic pulled out a Rolex with, honest-to-God, diamonds on the face. The whole thing gleamed obscenely, and Dominic longed to slide it on and feel the weight of it. This was the sort of thing that he had dreamed of as a kid, driving around town in a fancy car, with a hot girl in the passenger seat, and an expensive timepiece on his arm, in a primo coat. He'd be the envy of anyone he knew, but as he turned to go, he heard someone at the counter asking about the coat. "It was a Vanderfur. I donated it this morning, but my watch must have fallen out in the pocket. Please, I beg you, I need that watch back. It belonged to my father, and it has great sentimental value." Dominic intended to walk right on without acknowledging the man, finders keepers and all that, but as he caught sight of him in profile, he felt his breath whoosh out in a gasp. It was the guy from the broken mirror, the guy who lived so lavishly. Dominic couldn't have said why, but suddenly he was tapping the guy on the shoulder and holding out the expensive watch. "I heard what you were saying, sir. I came to buy this coat and found the watch in the pocket. It's too nice for me anyway," he said, smiling as the joke fell flat. The older man's smile went ear to ear. "Oh my God, thank you, young man. I can't believe how kind you are." "Yeah," Dominic said. "Me either." The man stood mooning over the watch for a few minutes as Dominic paid for his new coat. It was a little more than he strictly wanted to pay for a coat, but He found that he liked it, and it would help him remember a time when he'd been so generous. He started to think that maybe he could sell it for more than he'd paid for it, when someone stopped him on the sidewalk. The guy was running after him, asking him to wait as the watch threatened to slip off his wrist again. "I owe you something, at least, for being so kind," he said, panting a little as he caught his breath. "It's really okay, mister. You don't have to." "I insist," the man said, taking a watch out of his suit coat that looked almost as impressive as the one he was wearing. "My father bought me the watch you found when I was 18 and about to leave for college. This watch doesn't have nearly as much sentimental value, but I think it will help you nonetheless." He put the watch in Dominic's hand and patted it warmly. "I'm in your debt, sir. Hopefully, I can find a way to repay you someday." The watch was nice. Not as nice as the one he had, but still nice. Dominic sold it for about $1,300 and used the money to not only float himself for a while, but also buy a much cheaper timepiece that still looked richer than anything he'd ever owned. He too wanted a reminder of that warm feeling he had felt when he'd done something nice for someone else. With the rent on his dingy apartment paid for the next few months, Dominic was spending a lot of time watching the mirror. He had decided that the panel with the rich man might be his greatest friend, if his ex was to be his greatest enemy. The top and bottom corners were his past and future, and he used the former to enhance his own future often. The middle two were still a mystery to him, but he felt like they might make sense in time. The top panel, the one that took up the most space, however, made him a little more uneasy. It was gray, the sky full of cracks as it swam like a puddle when you throw a rock into it. Dominic felt like he knew that sky, but he couldn't place it. He'd never seen a gray sky like that in his life. Except he had. He knew he had. He just didn't know when. He tried to look at that space as little as possible, but it kept drawing his eye, making him want to take the mirror and throw it somewhere where it couldn't make him feel that way anymore. That was usually how he got stuck looking at the middle two panels. Anything to take his mind off that gray sky full of cracks. The mirror kept showing him things and leading him to opportunities, but it wasn't until he saw one of the faces from the middle panel that he thought he knew its true purpose. He would later reflect on what leap of ego had led him to believe that he knew the purpose of such a thing like this. He was at Marcy's buying groceries one day when he saw a familiar face in line, the true nature of the panel seeming to come to him. He'd seen the woman before. Too many mouths to feed and not enough hours in the day to work to feed them. She was standing at the register, her card having been declined, deciding between a gallon of milk and a box of diapers, to diaper the baby or have milk for the other 4. "Here," Dominic said, paying the cashier the remainder from his own wallet. He had no idea why he had been so moved to help, but it made him feel good to do so. The woman thanked him profusely, almost to an embarrassing degree, but Dominic told her not to worry about it. She could pay him back if she felt strongly about it, and here was a little more to get her through the week if she needed it. The woman cried as she tried to refuse him, but the money went into her purse regardless, and Dominic smiled as he watched her go. After that, he began to use his money to help others more often. The mirror helped him invest his windfalls, helped him change his life for the better, and as he grew, so did his altruism. Suddenly he was no longer giving money to single mothers or tipping bills into homeless people's cups, but he was helping the city open shelters, providing programs with startup capital so they could offer meals to people in need, and changing the poverty-stricken neighborhood he lived in for the better. That was how he reconnected with the man from the thrift store, and it was a meeting that would change his life forever. The mirror had shown him that today he would meet someone who would change his life, but he had never expected it to be the man who had begun his charity. As he gave the keynote speech, he could see an ocean of faces that had once looked hopelessly out of the mirror at him. He had given them the hope that they now saw, and the feeling made him tingle. He had always wanted to be someone who could help others, even as he struggled to help himself. He had never realized it. He had something worthwhile to give now, and he was on top of the world. As he ladled punch into a plastic cup, he heard a voice that he hadn't thought of in 4 years. "Looks like you've come a long way since the thrift store. I almost didn't recognize you until you started to speak up there." Dominic turned, and there was the man who had given him the watch. He extended a hand. "We've never been formally introduced. I'm David Rothschild, philanthropist and tech mogul." "Dominic Fraser, it's nice to see you again." And it was nice. The two of them talked for the rest of the afternoon, and when they parted ways at sunset, they were already working out plans for a venture together. Dominic had given him some stock advice, something the Mirror had showed him the day before, and the two parted with promises that they'd get together again very soon. Dominic returned to his apartment, the same dingy one-bedroom he'd lived in for years, wanting to see what the future had in store now that he'd found a man like David to partner with. Instead of grand business ventures and philanthropic outreach, however, he was greeted with himself stabbing his new friend to death. Dominic stared at the mirror for a moment, unsure of what he was seeing. This couldn't be his future. Why would he do such a thing? He had a lot of respect for David and couldn't imagine why he would want to hurt him. It had to be a fluke, a trick of the light. But every time he came back to the mirror, it showed him the same thing. His knife, red with David's blood, and David lying on the floor of his tiny apartment. It never changed. It never wavered. And Dominic decided that enough was enough where the mirror was concerned. He put it in the hall closet, shutting it and its proposed future away for good. At least, he hoped so. He spent a lot of time with David in the coming months. The two did a lot of good for the community, for many communities, and Dominic saw himself living a part of that lifestyle that he'd only seen through the mirror. Jet-setting, eating lavish meals, living the sort of life he had always dreamed about, and with a friend like David, he could live that life with an ease that he had never known. Dominic was the happiest he had ever been, or he would have been if not for the dreams. In the dreams, he always saw himself standing over David's corpse as he bled out onto the tacky carpet. In the dream, he could hear the sirens approaching as he stood over the man like a conquering hero. In the dream, Dominic knew that his life as he knew it was about to come to an end. It started very subtly. Dominic began spending days back at home instead of with David. He was busy with other projects. He needed to give attention to some local charities. He needed to reconnect with his roots and remember the people who needed him. These were all excuses he gave his new friend, but in reality, David had begun to resent his business partner. David Rothschild, who had everything except a criminal record and a checkered past. The more he thought about it, the more he wondered if David was going to mess him up on purpose. Did he know that Dominic was supposed to kill him? Was this his way of stealing his happiness? Just like that bitch of an ex-wife of his. Were they in this together? Was she so unhappy with his success that she would stoop to making him miserable again? Dominic spent all his time in his apartment, staring at the mirror and willing it to show him anything but the bloody end of his happiness. When the knock on his door came, he realized he hadn't left that apartment in weeks. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing the day before. Or was it the week before? They clung to him sweatily, and the smell from his pants made him think that he might have soiled himself. Now that he was back from his trance, he wondered when was the last time he had eaten. His stomach growled angrily, and he'd gotten up to go to the kitchen when he heard the knock again. "Dominic, are you there? Your secretary said I could find you here. Are you home?" David again. Dominic got up, walking angrily to the door. He could send him away. Better lose a friend than lose his life. He liked David a lot. He was a good friend, but he liked being a free man more. He had wasted 5 years in prison, and he'd be damned if he'd go back. He didn't care what some mirror had to say. He wasn't going to let anyone jeopardize his future. "Go away. I don't want to talk to you." "But why? What did I do?" Dominic closed his eyes, trying not to let the rage that was building behind them out. What had he done? Like he didn't know. He was only trying to steal his freedom from him. I don't owe you an explanation. Please, just leave. I don't want to hurt you. I'm not leaving until you tell me why you're acting like this. I'll stand here all night if I have to. I just want to see what's going on with you. I'm worried, Dominic. I'm worried about you. Dominic didn't remember opening the door, but suddenly the two men were face to face. Some of his neighbors were peeking out of their apartments, trying to see what was going on. Dominic just knew they would be something to talk about tomorrow, and he shuddered to think what sort of stories they might weave. A lover's quarrel? Maybe David had stolen Dominic's girlfriend? Maybe they had stolen money from each other? Who was to say? And all of it would likely paint Dominic the worse for it. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to see you. Can't you just respect my wishes and... Something's going on. You're not acting like yourself. Did someone say something to you? Did you hear something? There's a lot of rumors going around about me. It's the same with most rich people in my circles. I just want to know why you're so... Dominic was sick of hearing it and shut him up the only way he knew how to. David's tooth flew down the hallway when he hit him, and suddenly the two of them were rolling around the floor and throwing punches. It was the kind of ugly fighting you see in desperate people, and as it rolled into the apartment, Dominic realized he couldn't pummel David into submission. Despite being a decade older than him, the man was in better physical shape than he ever had a prayer of being. As David rained down blows on him, Dominic sent his hands searching for something to defend himself with. The knife was something he had lost years ago, a steak knife that had tumbled from his plate and rolled under the couch forever. But when his fingers locked onto it, he knew what to do. Before he knew what was happening, he was standing over David, the other having been stabbed more than a dozen times. The sirens were coming, and as Dominic let the knife slip from his numb fingers, he realized they had taken it from him anyway. His life, for better or worse, was over now. Well, not all of it. There was still a little more left. The trial had been short. They had found him in the apartment, with the murder weapon, and the victim, his prints all over both of them. There had been witnesses that had seen the two fight, and it seemed to be an open and shut case. The Rothschilds found a slew of witnesses willing to testify that Dominic had been the aggressor, and with his checkered past, all his lawyer could do was get him life. It had been a sham of a trial, and Dominic didn't know why the court had bothered with it. They wanted him to be guilty. The Mirror had told him as much, and now his life was over. The guards at Clarence County smiled knowingly when they saw him get off the bus. "Welcome back," that smile seemed to say, "and didn't we tell you you'd be back?" As he lay on the floor of his old cell, the cell they'd seemed to think it was so funny to put him back in, he realized what the gray sky had been showing him all along. As he lay on the filthy floor and looked at the cracks in the ceiling, he finally realized why they had looked so familiar. This was his life now, his life and his death, and he wondered how long he would have to look at those cracks and that pitted, pitiable concrete before someone came along and put him out of his misery. If the Mirror knew, it certainly wasn't telling anymore. I'm in the wind now. I'm sure I'll be dead by tomorrow, but I need to let people know this thing is loose. I'm an agent with the United States government, and my station is Blacksite number 7. I won't tell you my name. It wouldn't matter much anyway, but this was not how I saw my life going. I spent 6 years in Iraq, signed up right after high school. It was nothing like the recruiter told me it would be. I spent 8 hours in the blistering heat. I hauled my fair share of comrades out of firefights, and I saw a lot of crap out there that would make an ordinary person go crazier than I might be. I've had a camel spider crawl on me while I sleep. I watched friends I've known since basic get decapitated through binoculars, burned houses full of insurgents and civilians to rubble, and a lot of other things I really don't like to talk about. When I was done, they gave me my papers, thanked me for my service, and sent me home. I know I have no right to complain. Many guys didn't make it back. But home was worse. I'd spent 6 years in an active combat zone, and now I was just, supposed to come home and go back to civilian life? I spent 3 months in the civilian world. 2 of those months were spent in crappy apartments because my parents couldn't handle the night terrors and the jumpy Marine that their son had become. Every car horn, every barking dog, every firework rattling in the street had me reaching for my gun or breaking into a cold sweat when I couldn't find it. Before TJ found me, I was honestly considering killing myself. Then one day, he was just at my door with that big shit-eating grin he'd always worn in the desert. "You look like hell, Hoss. Let me get you some pancakes. I got something I want to discuss with you." TJ was my platoon leader in the sandbox. They called him the comedian because he was always smiling, always cracking jokes. He was a functional sociopath. I guess most of us were. I always admired his ability to laugh in the face of the messed up stuff we did. TJ is not his real name, clearly, but since he's still in this crap and I've left it behind, I figure the best I can do is not remind them that he's why I'm here. So he took me to breakfast. In the back of a crowded Denny's, he laid it all out for me. "You got it bad, Hoss, but that's okay, 'cause old Uncle TJ has the cure for you. Got a new job, familiar work that might interest you. Ever hear of Two Trees?" As it happened, I had. Two Trees was a government institute that, on the surface, did a lot of medical research and clinical trials. Underneath, though, they did wet work, and anyone who was involved in covert ops knew about Two Trees. We'd worked with them a few times in Iraq, and their guys were spooky, to say the least. "You're looking at the new head of Blacksite number 7. I furrowed my brow at him. "Congrats. Should I know what that is?" "Of course not. It's a closely guarded government secret. Two Trees is paying me a small fortune to keep it that way. Problem is, I need someone to curate the site for me. Someone with military training, experience with firearms, and a need for some normalcy. Know anyone that might fit that bill, Hoss?" I knew what he was asking, but I didn't think I was the one he was looking for. I hadn't found work in 3 months since I'd been back, and most of that was because I couldn't settle into anything. I was constantly jumpy, constantly on edge, and that makes it hard to find work. No one wanted you doing security work or minding a gas station when every backfiring car was an enemy combatant. What would happen if I had an episode in a government facility of all places? I shook my head. "Thanks, but no thanks. I don't think I'm fit for duty the way I am." "Yeah, I thought you might say that." He pulled a metal tin out of his front pocket and slid it across the table. "Your medical file reads like a bench work for PTSD, night terrors, irritability, being on edge, those irrational bouts of anger that got you thrown out of your parents' house." I felt defensive. "How did you know about that?" "You'd be surprised what my level of clearance will get you. The therapist records were about as hard to get as a beer at a gas station. Well, I got a little present for you, Hoss. Welcome to the rest of your life," he said, tapping the outside of the silver case. The case was about as big as an Altoids tin. There were no markings on it, no filigrees or needless ornaments, and it had the distinctly surgical look that you usually see with military tech. I slid my hand towards it, but I didn't seem to want to touch it. Every sense I had told me to walk away right now, not to touch that thing, and just walk away from this unassuming little case. I forced my hands to pop it open instead. Inside was a pair of gray gel caps. "What are these?" "These are the answer to your prayers. 2 of these a day will make you feel as calm and clear as you did when you were a lad of 18. No more jumping at every noise. No more reaching for your gun when a dog barks or a car backfires. Just peace of mind." Looking back, that's probably what Mephistopheles said when he spoke to Faust. "What's the catch? These pills are only available through the Two Trees Corporation. Employees who agree to be part of the clinical trials get them free of charge. But they're only available to employees," he said, with a little grin. "Take them. Take a day to feel the effects, and let me know what you think. Call me tomorrow and give me your answer. Enjoy a night of freedom, then make your decision." I took the pills home with me, and after a few hours of staring at them, I took them with some vodka. The effects were sudden and immediate. If you've never had PTSD, then it's hard to explain, but it's like having a loose wire and someone suddenly fixes it. Then you go back to the way you used to be. My anxiety just melted away. My fear dissipated. My unease and dread were gone, and my anger seemed like a distant memory. I was sitting in my crappy apartment, surrounded by the trappings of my depression and my anxiety, and suddenly, I felt like I had before I boarded that bus in 2003 and headed out to basic training.
I was finally comfortable in my own head. It was like coming back to a safe place after years of running from danger. After the first good night's sleep I'd had since shipping out, I called TJ and told him I was in. "One question," I asked. "What's in the pills that makes them work so well?" He was silent for a long minute, and then finally he said, "You really don't want to know, Hoss. Pack your stuff. There will be a moving truck to take you to West Virginia in the morning." And that is how I came to work at Blacksite number 7. I must have looked like a junkie by the time I pulled up in front of my new house. I didn't have much. The truck had taken all 4 boxes into the deep woods as I followed in my old compact. The journey took me about 16 hours, and by the time I got there, I was starting to feel the anxiety creep back in. I became angry at how slow the truck was going, afraid that this whole thing was a trick and they would kill me. By the time I arrived, I found myself wanting to die, hoping for death, so I could return to the quiet that had been in my head before. That was when I saw TJ standing at the gate of what looked like an old military checkpoint. He flashed that knowing smile and handed me another silver case. I dry swallowed the pills without a word and felt the inner peace worming its way back into my brain. Then he showed me to my new quarters. It was a little bunk room with a bed, a kitchenette, and a locker for my clothes. There was a foot locker for my personal stuff, and I was told to keep the place clean. I would be responsible for the site and its security. TJ showed me a terminal off the bedroom for monitoring and camera feeds. The compound had cameras all over the place, but I appeared to be the only person here full-time. Site's mostly for storage these days, but it's what we get up to here at night that may interest you. That's why you're here. I need someone I can trust to watch this site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 4 times a year, you'll be relieved for a week of R&R somewhere. But other than that, this is your world, Hoss. That didn't bother me. I had no problem being alone after 3 months of people. What I was curious about was what I would be doing out here. What am I looking at exactly? TJ pointed at the 3 buildings on the camera. Truck comes twice a week. Let them through the gate and don't bother them. They'll take what they need from the building and won't bother you either. Keep nosy people out. Lethal force is authorized, and don't ever go in there, or I'll have to show you where Blacksite 8 is, he said with a smile. The smile didn't make it to his eyes. Don't worry about being vigilant, though. If anything bigger than a mouse moves out there, the alarms will let you know about it right away. He told me that my food would be delivered once a week, mostly MREs, and I could order anything I wanted from the terminal in the living room. There was a workout yard near the second building, and I could move through the woods if I chose, as long as I took my phone with me so I could get alerts from the console. "By the way, hand me your phone," he said. When I did, he put it in his pocket and handed me a new one. "That's your new phone. I'll take the keys to your car, too, and put the money in your account. This is your life now, Hoss, so don't take this job lightly. If you leave the grounds, we'll know. If you try to update social media or try to tell anyone on the outside about what you've seen here, we'll know. If you want to get married or feel like you need out, arrangements can be made after your first 5-year tour. As far as anyone is concerned, you no longer exist. Don't be stupid. Put in your 5 years, and we'll reassess your position then." He grinned again and punched me in the arm. "And lighten up. This'll be the easiest 5 years of your life." From that point on, I was an employee of Two Trees. TJ had been right. The first 5 years flew by. I lived on the site, spending my days working out or watching TV. I played the latest video games and watched the newest movies. Twice a week, as advertised, a truck rolled up and honked. I would check the cameras, open the gates, and they would do the rest. They would honk when they were ready to leave, and I left them alone. The trucks always had the Two Trees logo on them, and they never popped in to give me any crap, and I never went out to give them any. I never tried to get into the warehouses. I'd been a soldier long enough to know how to check my curiosity, and the scares were minimal. The food kept coming, the pills kept coming, and kept me in the right mind, too, and it was pretty peaceful, all told. The alarms, to my knowledge, only went off 3 times in that first year. 2 of those times, it was a deer who had wandered too close. The first time it happened, I had slunk out in a panic, service pistol in hand and boxer shorts flapping. As I rounded the first warehouse, I drew down on a very surprised doe who darted away before I could draw a bead on her. It was kind of a special moment for me. I had never seen a deer up close, and as it ran away, I was glad I hadn't shot it. The third time the alarm went off, it was a person, though. It was the first person I'd seen in 3 months. I'd been sitting at the console one night watching the latest Marvel Avengers movie. I think it might have been Infinity Wars. When the alarm went off, I paused the movie, expecting to see a deer or a rabbit on the monitor. My eyes went wide, though, when I realized it was a person. He had a crowbar. He was attempting to pry the door open. He must have come out of the woods, because if he had driven up, I would have known about it sooner. It had been 3 months since I'd seen another person. The last one had been Agent Daughtry, who'd come to relieve me for a week of R&R in September. The idea of seeing a person not connected with Two Trees made me feel weird. Even when you were on R&R, you went to a company resort or a company place full of company people. This stopped you from getting a little too drunk and talking about all the stuff you did for your country. It was a great idea, but it meant you had nearly no interaction with civilians. I took my pistol out and crept up on him in near silence. When my foot came down on an extra crunchy stick, he turned his head and noticed me. He raised the crowbar as if to attack, and the rest was instinct. The gun went off without me having even spoken to him, reflexes taking over and dropping the threat before it could become a real danger. His left eye popped like an overripe fruit, and he fell down on the hard December ground. I called TJ, and he and some of the other men in suits came to assess the damage. You did just right, Hoss. He was a threat to the facility and needed to be put down. Don't think for a minute that this reflects poorly on you. What will you do with him? I asked. TJ smiled. Immediate disposal, Hoss. Think you got the stomach to help us? I found that I did, and once he was doused in gasoline, we set him ablaze at the edge of the property. They gave me a week of R&R for that, and when I came back, TJ must have decided that I was worthy of being brought in on certain things. The alarm went off about a week after I'd come back from R&R, and I saw a black car rolling up the front gate. TJ stepped out of it and waved as it stopped in the concrete roundabout, other men getting out as well. I slid my shoulder holster on and went out to meet him. It was 11 p.m., and a visit this late was highly irregular. As I approached the vehicle, 2 guys in suits were bringing a man with a bag on his head out of the car. He was wearing scrubs, his hands bound behind his back, and I could hear him crying beneath the black hood he wore. I looked between them, waiting for an explanation, and TJ threw an arm around me and walked me towards the spot where we had burnt the trespasser. Hoss, I think it's time that we bring you in on the second reason for Blacksites. You see, sometimes Two Trees has assets that need to be eliminated. The Blacksites are often used for this purpose. It's always the responsibility of the site's caretaker to carry out the elimination. Fringe benefits, I suppose you could say. Why wasn't I told this before? I asked, feeling indignant. I'm no murderer. Oh, well, those combatants in Iraq will be glad to hear that, won't they? He said almost snidely. That was war, TJ. This is murder. Think of this as war too, Hoss. These people are enemies, and they need to be eliminated for the good of the public safety. It's part of the job, Hoss, a part I know firsthand that you're capable of. They put the man on his knees in the middle of the burn spot, and I could hear him praying under that hood as we stood around him. Put him down, Hoss. That's an order, TJ said. And if I won't, I said, looking at him icily. The 2 men on either side drew their guns, and TJ grinned. Then I'm afraid that these men will have to execute both of you. Come on, Hoss. Don't throw this away over some nobody. He's no different than the man outside the warehouse. Looking back, I kinda just wish I'd let them shoot me. But I guess if I had, you'd never know about any of this. Instead, I drew out my gun and put a bullet in his skull, glowering at TJ as his buddies put their guns away. You made the right choice, Hoss. Who knows, you might not have to do this more than a dozen times in the next 4 years. On that note, he was wrong. I executed an asset a month after that. They were mostly people in scrubs, people in lab coats, doctors, researchers, people who had likely tried to steal from whatever facility they worked at. They were men, women, old men, and scared 20-somethings. I never bothered to learn their names. They were just assets that needed to be eliminated. I became kind of numb to the process. We burned them afterwards. Gasoline and fire made it like they were never there. The spot near the edge had a charred look to it for a while after that. At the end of 5 years, TJ came to see me and asked if I wanted to re-up. What happens if I walk away? I asked. I was eating dinner when he came by, and he had sat down to have a plate of fettuccine with me. Given my free time, I had learned to do a good number of things that I couldn't before. I became a pretty good cook. I learned to play the guitar, read every book on the shelf I had bought to hold them, and there was a chainsaw out back along with some sculptures I had made with it. I couldn't say I hadn't enjoyed my time here, the killings aside, but I was curious to know if they'd actually let me leave. You'll be allowed to return to the real world, your bank account fuller and your retirement substantial. Just watch what you say out there. I'd hate to have to bring you back for your replacement to put a bullet in. I ended up signing up for another 4 years. I shouldn't have done that. I was 8 years deep when they brought the girl in the black bag to me. It was 2 a.m., and I had started to think about going to bed when the alarm went off. I saw the town car rolling up and looked for TJ. He was not the one that climbed out, however. This guy had his hair slicked back, his suit a perfect blue pinstripe. He didn't wave at me, and I felt a sense of dread as I grabbed my gun. Somehow I expected TJ to be under that bag this time. The man's name was Stein, and luckily he did not have TJ under that bag. What he did have was a kid with a thick black bag over their head. I couldn't tell at first if it was a boy or a girl. They were dressed in baggy clothes, Salvation Army rags that a homeless guy would be embarrassed to wear, and they were crying loudly under their hood. 2 familiar men had the kid, and they both looked stoic about the whole matter. Stein didn't say anything, just led the procession over to the charred spot and put the kid on their knees. When he didn't take the hood off, I did it myself. He winced, but he didn't stop me. This was my place, my job, and I had garnered a reputation for being a professional, a reputation I was about to ruin. The bag came off, and the little girl's tear-streaked face came into view in the harsh fluorescence. Her hair was cut short, dirty blonde, and her face was covered in bruises. Her nose looked broken, her lip split. The blood trickled down her face like red tears, and they mingled with her actual tears as they fell to the damp earth. I sighed, looking at Stein as the gun stayed at the ready. The hell is this? Stein looked surprised. It's an asset. TJ said you could handle these for us. Handle the asset. This is a kid, barely old enough to wipe her own ass. What could she have possibly done? Stein's face was stony. Yours is not to question, soldier. Liquidate this asset, or be liquidated. I looked at the kid, her whole face shaking as the tears and blood fell, and I thought about watching her head pop like a grape. This wasn't some scared adult, some stoic old man, some praying woman, or some cursing thing in a sallow skin. This was a kid. I had killed a lot of people, more in my time here than I ever had during war, but I was still a professional. Professionals had standards. No, I said. Stein blinked. What? No, I don't kill kids. Do it yourself. The 2 men drew their guns, and I was transported back in time. I was standing there, 2 days after Christmas, watching TJ grin and tell me the rules. Now I was standing in the woods, the autumn leaves carpeting the ground, feeling sure that it would soon drink both my blood and the girl's. I'll give you till the count of 3 to kill the girl. After that point, you will both be executed. 1. Their guns were unwavering, but so was my resolve. 2. I closed my eyes and prepared to die. 3. I heard a sound like wet concrete splitting open. It was followed by a high-pitched scream and a pair of bodies hitting the ground. I opened my eyes and saw Stein running towards the town car, his composure gone. The 2 men who'd been holding me at gunpoint were bleeding out on the ground from large, grisly neck wounds. As I watched Stein run, a rust-red something snapped out and caught him in the back of the neck, dropping him inches from the town car. The red thing protruded from the front of his neck, and he gasped futilely as he lay dying. I looked back in the direction of the thing that had snapped out and saw that the girl was now a mass of red spikes, segmented like spider legs. Her face had split down long ways, forcing her face into a grisly sideways maw. The area between the teeth glowed a deep red, and I could see the eyes on the girl's face blinking erratically. The 2 halves of her smile grinned at me, and the effect was a little dizzying. I figured for the second time that day that I was going to die, but she scuttled off into the woods instead, walking on her strange spidery appendages as she crashed through the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, not quite sure I believed I wasn't dead, and then I started running too. I crashed through the woods for hours, running in no particular direction, sure that at any minute the creature or a helicopter from 2 trees would fall on me and either rip me to pieces or just blow me away. I was blundering off with no wallet, no cell phone, just my gun and the clothes I'd been wearing. Was the phone how they tracked me? TJ hadn't said as much, but I kind of figured it was. When the ground went out from under me, I felt the air drop out of my lungs. I fell 5 feet off the muddy ledge and skinned my hands. My knees hurt where I had landed on them, and I realized pretty quick that I had fallen onto the road. If I thought it might be an illusion, the headlights that pinned me to the ground a moment later left me with little doubt. I was kind of numb to the idea of dying at this point, and I just lay there waiting to be run over. Thankfully, the truck stopped, and after a short conversation with the driver, he offered to take me into town. That's how I came to be here in this dingy hotel that just happens to have a computer in the lobby. I sold the gun for about $500 and figured I'd disappear as soon as I'm done writing this. They know I'm gone now, but I don't know if they think I'm dead or if they think I ran. Either way, they'll find me. I'm pretty sure of it. I'm more worried about the little girl that's loose in the woods, and whatever it is that's living beneath their skin. If you see a young girl with short, dirty blonde hair, do not approach her. I don't know if she killed those men to get away, or if she killed them because she wanted to, but she should be considered dangerous if you encounter her in the wild. And if a man from Two Trees offers you a job, do not become the new curator of Blacksite 7. The job is definitely not at all what it appears to be. I'm not sure which was weirder, the fact that Dad had a hole in his head, or the fact that he was just so unimpressed with it. Dad had come home from his job at the steel mill, just as he had 1,000 times. We heard him sit his hard hat down by the door as he stripped out of his jumpsuit before coming to dinner. Mom had meatloaf on the table with potatoes and peas, Dad's favorite, and we waited patiently for him to arrive like we always did. If this sounds weird to you, that's because it should. Dad had a strange idea that he should go to work, Mom should stay at home and keep the kids, and that everyone should look like an episode of Leave It to Beaver when he got home. I remember for a while, Mom met him at the door with a cold glass of beer when he came home. He eventually told her to stop so that the dust from the mill didn't get on her. It was odd, but Dad paid the bills, and that's how he liked it, so that's what we did. Mom had gotten half of her welcome home greeting out before it curdled in her throat. My brother had already seen it, but I was still looking at the TV around the corner and hadn't seen it yet. MTV was playing a song by a band I liked, and I looked up at Mom to ask if I could use the bathroom when I noticed Dad's head. Dad, meanwhile, had sat down at the table like nothing was amiss, opening his napkin and putting it on his lap. He was hungry from a day at work, and he had just started asking us about our own day when he noticed our horrified looks. What? What's the matter? All three of us were speechless for a moment. How did he not realize what had us all so gobsmacked? Surely he had to feel that. He had to realize what had happened to him. There was no way that a person could be so oblivious of something like that. In the center of Dad's forehead was a hole big enough to stick your pinky finger into. It wasn't like a wound. Wounds usually bleed or appear red or scabby. This one was simply a black hole in his forehead. The edges looked a little ragged, but that more reminded me of a hole that someone had drilled into the pavement than a wound. As strange as the hole was, the fact that it didn't seem to have an exit point was even stranger. "Honey," Mom asked, trying to be diplomatic about the situation, Did something happen at work today?" "No," Dad said, looking at her speculatively. "Well, Stubbins was changing the no-slip grating on the walkways, but that's really not that weird, I guess." Are you sure nothing odd happened today?" she asked, trying to tiptoe around the matter so she didn't upset him. Sometimes Dad could have a temper, and none of us wanted to see it. "I guess, maybe," he seemed to think about it. "There was this guy I bumped into on the sidewalk. I fell down, and he helped me up, but it was nothing." When she continued to look at him skeptically, he set his fork down angrily and glowered at her. "Look, Martha, if you have something to ask, then just go ahead and ask it. I'm trying to eat here." "Dad, there's a huge hole in your freaking head." I was never what you'd call subtle. Dad wrinkled his eyebrows at me. "What in the hell are you talking about?" "There's a hole in your forehead. How do you not feel that? Are you trying to be funny? 'Cause you know I don't like jokes." Despite his gruff tone, though, he began feeling around his forehead, as if trying to find the source of discomfort. He seemed half-hearted, like he was just doing it as a favor, by looking at it in the first place. But when his fingers touched the ragged edges of the hole, he shuddered a little. I didn't think it had hurt him, not really. It was more like the shudder you get when you have an itch and you scratch it. He inspected it with his fingers for a moment, before getting up to look at it in the bathroom mirror. The three of us hovered just outside the door as he looked at it in the mirror, and we must have looked like some old comedy routine as we waited for his prognosis. After a few minutes of poking and prodding at it, he finally turned away and walked past us, leaving us just standing there. We found him at the kitchen table, eating his dinner like any other night. "Sit down. Your mother's meatloaf is getting cold," he told us, once he noticed we were there. "Dad," I started, but Mom put a hand on my shoulder. "Harold, there's a hole in your head. Don't you think we should go to the hospital?" Dad turned his emotionless gaze on her, making it clear that he didn't want to talk about it. When we didn't move, he growled in his throat in a deep, phlegmy way. Doctor won't be able to do anything but poke at it and charge me an arm and a leg. Not going to no doctor. Now sit down and eat. Then he went back to eating, ignoring us until we returned to the table and ate as well. We all tried not to notice the hole as we ate, but it was hard to ignore. As we sat and watched TV that night, the TV screen seemed to reflect off that dark hole. Mom laughed every time the audience did, but Dad never did. Well, that's not entirely true. Dad did this thing when he found something funny. 1 part chuckle and 9 parts phlegmy rumble. When I was a kid, I had asked Mom once why Dad never laughed or smiled, and she told me that he laughed often and smiled daily. It's just hard to tell with your father. He's not quite as obvious about it as the rest of us are. After that, I started paying more attention to Dad, and I'd come to the point where I could pick up on the subtle twitches at the corner of his mouth, the gravelly rumble when he chuckled, the minute crinkling at the edges of his beetle-black eyes. They helped me tell when my dad was in a good mood, and when he felt less like hitting and more like patting, when you could ask him for a favor, when it was best to leave him alone. It was a talent my younger brother never learned, and it was a mistake that often earned him a cuff upside the back of the head when he'd try to hit Dad up for money. Dad was enjoying the byplay tonight as Raymond bemoaned everything from his mother to his job, but my mind was still firmly fastened on the hole. As I watched it, I almost fancied that I could see it expand and retract as though it were breathing. I told myself it was the light from the TV, but the longer I watched, the surer I became that it was moving. It was like a ragged mouth, pulling in and pushing out air. It was subtle, like my father's moods, and the longer I watched, the more apparent it became. When my father turned his gaze on me, I realized he had caught me staring. Either go to bed or stop staring at me. You're creeping me out. I pushed off the love seat and went to my room. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on anything as long as that hole was on display. The next few days were uneventful, I guess, but I noticed that Dad started wearing a hat when he went outside. I wished he would wear it inside too, because the hole seemed to always be watching me whenever I was around him. It wasn't, of course, because it didn't have any eyes, but I could feel that itchy feeling you sometimes get when someone's staring at you. It looked like it was getting bigger, too. But if it pained Dad, he didn't say anything about it. He mostly ignored it, his only exception to ignoring it being the hat he wore outside. Dad was stubborn, but he wasn't foolish. Dad was a sensible person who liked to keep attention off himself. Over the next 10 days, the hole got noticeably bigger. When we'd first seen it, it had been maybe big enough to put your pinky finger inside. Now I could have easily put several in there, and still he refused to go to the hospital. Mom tried to coax him, but he said it wasn't worth bothering a doctor over. If it was bad, it would hurt, and it doesn't. If it means to go away, it'll do it on its own. He went to work, came home, watched TV, and all the time that hole continued to grow. I found myself looking at my father more and more often, that gaping chasm seeming to look at me, even when his hat was on. I started having dreams about that hole, and in my dreams it oozed and bled, and a single eyeball rolled around to look at me. No matter what Dad was doing in the dream, that eye stared at me until I came awake, gasping. Then one day, he came to breakfast, and the hole had taken in his eyebrows. It wasn't a hole now, it was more like a pit, a crater, that just so happened to sit in the middle of my father's head. Mom was left with an egg halfway to her mouth as she stared into that gaping void. We could all see it breathing now, the push and pull of its respiration as it drew in its terrible breath. Dad sat eating his own eggs and grits, pretending like nothing was wrong, but it was clear that he felt it too. He refused to answer any of us when we called his name, and left for work with his breakfast only half eaten. I noticed that when he came home from work that day, there was a different hard hat on the table in the entryway. The hard hat had a slant to it and would better cover the hole. Dad may act like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't. I started avoiding him. I would come down to breakfast late since I knew he'd be at work. I would make excuses to stay out so I could miss dinner. I did any number of other things to avoid being in the house, but it hardly seemed to matter. I had begun to hear some kind of strange whispering as I lay in bed at night, and it permeated my dreams as the eye inside began to whisper words I didn't understand. The words were alien, harsh, and unwantable, but I felt I knew their meaning. My sleep became as ragged as my father's moods, and if I hadn't been barely into my senior year of high school, I think I would have moved out. Then about a month and a half after the spot appeared, Dad didn't come down for breakfast. Mom told us that Dad wasn't feeling well. She said he must have gotten sick in the night, but the way her eyes looked told me something beyond sickness was at play. He didn't go to work that day, and unknown to us, he would never go back to work again. Mom moved into the guest bedroom, and I wouldn't find out till later it was because Dad had locked the door and wouldn't let her in. We could hear him in there bumping around. Mom would leave food in the hallway, but we never saw him take it. This went on until one morning when I forgot my notebook upstairs. I'd been heading to school, leafing through my bag, when I realized I'd forgotten my biology notebook. I had a test that day, and I wanted to study before class. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the door to my parents' bedroom open. I stopped halfway up, not sure whether I should continue or not. None of us had seen Dad since he went into hiding, and my brother and I had been very curious about what was happening with the hole. I put my fingers on the carpet and scrambled slowly up the stairs, peeking over the edge of the stairs as I heard the scrape of silverware being bumped. I could see my father's back, clad in a bathrobe and knee socks, as he bent over for the day's breakfast tray that my mom had left for him. He seemed to be having trouble grabbing it, and his hands threatened to knock over the juice that she had set beside the bowl of oatmeal. Then he stood up, and I had to put my hand over my mouth as he came into view. The top of his head looked like nothing so much as one of those cartoon holes they used to trap each other. It was a swirling black vortex that looked a mile deep, and as he turned to go back into the room, I could see the hole was like some kind of optical illusion. It was exactly as deep on the other side as it was on the back. He turned and took the tray back into the bedroom, but when he bumped the tray on the corner of the door, I realized why we had heard him banging around so much the last few days. In my dream, the hole always had an eye, but in reality, it had stolen my father's sight. The dreams became different after that. Every night I dreamed that my family was eating around the breakfast table. My brother sat on my left, my mom sat on my right. Dad sat across from me, bent over his breakfast as usual. They all sat eating food from a massive pile, their breakfast more like a buffet. I seemed to be the only one paying attention to the strange creature wearing father's clothes, and the food he ate was pushed into the circle hole atop his head. As I watched, the eye emerged again, but it wasn't alone this time. The eye was in a face, and the face was long and terrible. The skin was tan and leathery, like a hide left out in the sun too long. The hair was white and fine like a corpse's. The teeth were jagged and yellow, its eyes the cataract threads of the chronically blind, and when its face rolled around to look at me, I would shake as its lips rose in an almost comical grin. As everyone ate, the mouth opened and a low whisper began to assault my ears. Every night, that whisper became a little louder, and over time, I came to understand the words, "Shally shally may ray, fori fori may gra, li raleigh grega, su raleigh drema." The words slid into my ears like slugs, coating my brain in the forbidden knowledge they possessed. I wasn't sure what the dream meant, but I knew that they were meant for me. Was this the thing that had been staring at me the whole time? Was this the reason I had felt watched? As the dreams continued, I began humming or reciting the words that spoke to myself during the day. I would catch myself making little rhymes out of it, and they were never far from my mind. It was almost soothing to speak those words, a balm to the terrible dreams and the terrible fear that wormed its way through my mind. I knew what it wanted me to do, and one night, I did my part. I needed to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, my bladder full to bursting. I was leaving the bathroom when I noticed that the door to my parents' room was open for the first time in a long time. There was a noise coming from inside, and it sounded pained. I thought maybe one of the dogs had gotten in there and gotten hurt, but I think even then, I knew what I would find. Dad was on the ground, his swirling head practically hyperventilating as it pulled in and out. The swirls had taken in Dad's shoulders and the top of his chest. He was lying on the floor, flopping around as his arms protruded from the vortex. I reached down and helped him sit with his back to the bed. He couldn't talk, probably couldn't even see, but he seemed to understand that I was there to help him. As I looked at the swirling mass, though, I felt the words come to my lips. I don't know if they were intentional, but I know they were the words that needed to be said. Shali Shali Rema, Fori Fori Megra, Li Raleigh Grega, Su Raleigh Drema. As the words fell from me, I saw something swirling in the mass of shadows. I was worried it would be the huge eye, like the one I'd seen in my dreams, but I was even more afraid that it would be the ancient face that I often saw amidst the vortex. As it swirled and thrummed, I could see the white hair beginning to sprout from the depths. The head was coming on fast, and as those eyes emerged from the depths, I could see the corners cast up in a smile. My shaky legs took me away from him with small, stuttery steps. His face came free of the murk, but it wasn't done yet. As his head slid free, a withered form emerged beneath it. He was naked, looking like some kind of wizened mummy, as his leathery skin slid from the dark pool. Below the dark pit that had made up my father's head, his body began to shrivel up like a 4th of July firework, becoming blackened embers before my eyes. The more of that evil thing that came free, the less of him there was, and when his withered feet touched down on the soft carpet of my parents' bedroom, what remained of my father simply blew away. The old man reached down for the grubby bathrobe that Dad had been wearing, and tittered as he pulled it around himself.
Took you long enough, but I guess I can't be upset. You and your father have served me well, though you never realized you were doing it. Your reward is not sharing in his fate. Your punishment is knowing you are responsible for my return to this world. What you do with these gifts is up to you.
Then he left, just walked out of our house and into the night. As the sun comes up over my mother's kitchen, I realize I've been writing this since I managed to get back to my feet and walk shakily down the stairs. I've been trying to write down as much of this experience as possible so I won't forget any of it, but it's so weird, and it's hard to put it all into words. What the hell was that thing that ultimately killed my father? Did it make the hole in his head? Why him? As I sit here watching the sun come up, I realize I may never know. I've been searching for this tape most of my life. I've thought about nothing else since it was taken from me 12 years ago. As I sit in my grandmother's bedroom, holding the familiar red plastic in my hands, I feel a sense of inner peace. I know that my search is over, and that serenity can follow. Mr. Harzows Corner was a show that I watched religiously from the age of 4 to 6. It wasn't some mysterious TV show that I saw on basic cable. It wasn't some scrambled signal I got from a weird public access network. It was actually something I found at a church rummage sale. The box of VHS tapes was sitting on a little table with the words 5 for $1 scrolled across it in permanent marker. I had leafed through it and seen the usual church swap meet stuff. Winnie the Pooh, Veggie Tales, all the Disney movies with their cracked plastic windows and dirty fingerprints on the names. But nothing really stood out. I had selected a few Winnie the Pooh episodes when I found the dirty plastic cassette near the bottom. It had a lurid red body, the color similar to old lipstick, and a handwritten name on the front. The black magic marker name read Mr. Harzows Corner, and it immediately caught my attention for some reason. I picked it up and just looked at it for a moment. I had grown up in an age of strange cassette tapes. Nickelodeon put out the chunky orange cassette tapes that often had episodes of Rugrats or Wild Thornberrys. And even some of the VeggieTales cassettes were different colors, depending on whether they were holiday specials or not. This one, however, seemed odd right off the bat. The plastic just felt thick in my fingers, and I remember both wanting to put it down and never put it down again. Finally, after 10 minutes of just looking at it, I did put it down, and I grabbed 2 cassettes featuring episodes of Barbie's Dream House, a Nickelodeon cassette featuring the Rugrats, and 2 with handwritten names saying they were old Winnie the Pooh cartoon episodes. I brought them to my mom, and after looking over them, she nodded and gave me $1. I had taken them to Miss Wazowski, the cheery old lady who often organizes these rummage sales, and she put them in a plastic grocery bag and smiled at me as I walked to rejoin my mom. It wasn't until I got home that I realized there was a 6th tape in that bag, though. I had just turned on the VCR TV combo in my room when I realized there was an unfamiliar, yet very familiar red cassette tape at the bottom of the bag that had definitely not been there when I'd checked out. I picked it up and saw that Mr. Harzows Corner was scrawled across the front, and it was weird that I didn't remember picking it up at all. Instead of putting it back, I put it in the VCR and watched as the static began to clear on the screen. I had been intending to watch some of the Winnie the Pooh episodes, but the bag of tapes would sit forgotten for quite some time. Mr. Harzows Corner would be the only thing I really cared about for the foreseeable future. The show appeared to be nothing special. It was clearly a Mr. Rogers knockoff, but the Mr. Harzow character was strange, yet endearing. He looked normal enough, a slight blonde guy, taller than your average kids show host, with a corduroy jacket and a pair of battered jeans that covered the tops of his Reebok sneakers. The camera showed him coming into a normal living room, again very reminiscent of Mr. Rogers, and then greeting everyone with a big smile and a waving hand. "Good afternoon, boys and girls. And of course, a very special afternoon to children of all ages. Welcome to Mr. Harzows Corner. Know that I am glad to see you, and that I am always here, just for you." As it went on, Mr. Harzows Corner turned out to be nothing like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Mr. Rogers often taught children life lessons about accepting people and being a friend, and lessons about how the world worked. Mr. Harzows Corner was more like having your own personal therapist inside your TV. Mr. Harzow taught no life lessons. He went on no adventures in make-believe. He just sat in his big easy chair with a cup of tea at his elbow and listened. First time I watched the episode, I was a little bit confused. After his greeting, he just leaned back and looked at me, smiling in a very strange way. His smile was warm, inviting even, but he seemed to be waiting for someone on the other end of the camera to begin talking. He just sat there staring at me, and I began to become a little creeped out. Even at 4, I knew it was a little bit unusual for adults to just sit there and stare at you. I remember reaching out to hit stop on the tape when suddenly Mr. Harzow cocked his head and seemed to speak directly to me. "Leaving so soon? I understand. Well, I'm glad you came to see me today. I hope you'll come again very soon." My fingers stopped over the button. Was he talking to me? It seemed like he had been, but this was just a VHS tape. This was an age before interactive tapes, and the idea that the VHS could talk to you was a little eerie, but also a little bit interesting. When he had spoken directly to me, I remembered feeling a little sad that I was leaving already. He seemed like he understood, but maybe he was a little sad to see me go as well. I recalled my hand, and that big grin spread across his face again. "Changed your mind? I'm so glad. So why don't you tell me about your day? I'm sure I'd love to hear all about it." I sat for a moment, thinking about what to do. Finally, I told the smiling stranger on the tape about my day. I told him about my mother, and going to the rummage sale, about finding his cassette tape, about bringing all the cassette tapes home, and discovering that his cassette tape was in with the ones I'd bought. I told him I hoped I wouldn't get in trouble for having 6 instead of 5 cassette tapes, because my mother would think I had stolen it and she would get mad. Through it all, Mr. Harzow just sat and nodded, smiling his smile and listening as if I had the most interesting things in the world to talk about. Even at 4, though, I began to think that this was just someone pretending to listen. I remember thinking back to shows like Dora the Explorer, where Dora would ask a question and then pretend to listen to your answer. No matter what you told her to do, whether it was to go towards the next thing she had to do or sit in the grass and look at the clouds, she always came up with the right answer and went off to do what she was supposed to. I assumed that Mr. Harzow would do the same. He would interrupt me any minute now, just like Dora did if you spoke for too long, and start on some pre-scripted bit of dialogue. But he didn't. He sat and listened politely until I was done speaking. Then he nodded and answered me as if we were two people having a normal conversation. "It sounds as though it's been an exciting day for you. I'm glad you got to go and do something important, something that you enjoy. It's a real honor to be part of your life, and I hope we can be friends for many years to come." I spent the rest of the day in my room, talking with Mr. Harzow and telling him about my family, my home, and my life. He always seemed interested in my stories, and he always listened with that big smile and that fatherly way of talking about everything. My mom called me for dinner, and he said he would wait for me to come back. When I returned, he was still sitting and looking at the screen like I had never left. He asked me about dinner, and we talked until it was time for me to go to bed. "Will I see you tomorrow?" he asked, and I assured him that he would. I nearly left the TV on and just went to bed, but something told me that might be a bad idea. Not because the tape was cursed or haunted, but because Mom might come in and find it on. She might talk to Mr. Harzow, and Mr. Harzow might decide to be her friend instead of mine. The thought of losing Mr. Harzow, even after such a short time, made me feel furious, and I turned off the tape and went grudgingly to bed. I spent the next 5 months with my nose pressed against the TV screen, and Mr. Harzow listening to all my problems and woes. When my mom grounded me after the dog knocked the lamp over, he listened and consoled me. When my dad accidentally bumped me and I fell down the last 3 stairs, he was the one who told me it would all be okay. Every childhood problem, every unforeseen event, Mr. Harzow was there for me. It wasn't just that he listened. It wasn't even his advice that made me love him so. When Mr. Harzow talked to you, you felt like you were the most important person in the world. His attention was the most important thing you could ever have, and my 4-year-old brain drank that attention in. I became hesitant to leave the house, making up excuses why Mom couldn't go places, since I'd have to come with her. I wanted to spend every waking moment with my new friend, but something on the horizon would leave me with even less time with my dear Mr. Harzow. When I had to start kindergarten, Mr. Harzow told me how it would be new and exciting, and how he wanted to hear all about it when I got home. I attended kindergarten for about a week, coming straight home to lay on the floor of my room and talk with my new friend. When Mom got a new job. She had landed a job as a tech support supervisor for a new company, which meant she couldn't take me after school anymore. Dad worked in a prison, so he was almost always at work. It began to look like I might have to go into after-school care. I was understandably upset about this, because it would limit the already slim time I had to chat with Mr. Harzow. Fortunately, there was an alternative. My grandmother agreed to take me after school. My grandmother lived alone, my grandfather having died before I was born, and I think she was excited about watching me. Grandma had been very sad since my grandfather's passing, and it had turned her into a quiet shell of her former self. My mom always talked about what an outspoken and vivacious woman my grandmother had been when she was younger, and now it seemed like I might get to meet this new grandma. As bad as it sounds, I wasn't really all that interested in any of it, though. I simply wanted a place with a VHS player so I could watch my tape. At first, that was all we did, too. Grandma would pick me up from school, asking how my day had been, and asking what I might like to do once we got home, and I would tell her that I wanted to watch my tapes in the den. She would offer to bake cookies with me or maybe take me to the park, but I was fully invested in the silky voice of Mr. Harzow. I would come in and lay my book bag down and go sit in the den for hours as I talked quietly to my good friend about everything and anything. He smiled when I told him about my grandma and said it was nice that I was keeping her company. Grandmothers are such a valuable resource of knowledge, and the fact that you have such a good relationship with yours is truly special. I agreed, but I was still very guarded about the tape. I would often turn it off when Grandma brought me snacks or asked if I was interested in going outside. I didn't want her to see Mr. Harzow, and I think I was still afraid that she would take him away from me if she saw him. She would want him to be her friend, and then I would be unable to see him since he would want to spend all his time with her. Mr. Harzow never said as much. All of his advice was placidly given through the TV after he had sat and listened to me. But I knew that if I coveted this tape, then others might as well. Over time, Grandma did manage to coax me out of the den. I was 5 after all, and the smell of cookies or the promise of ice cream had a talismanic effect on me still. Mr. Harzow became an after-dinner friend, a rainy day friend, but I still found myself wanting to spend as much time with him as I could. No matter what I was doing, playing on the swings or sitting in class or making cookies with Grandma, or even sleeping in my bed, it seemed that I was thinking about Mr. Harzow. I would find myself hungry for any time I could get with him, and there were nights that I quietly whispered to him from the floor of my room as my parents slept not too far away. It didn't come to a head until I got careless at Grandma's house one day. It had been the best day my 6-year-old brain could remember. Grandma had taken me to the local carnival, more of a street fair than a regular fair, and I had done it all. I had ridden ponies, I had eaten so much I thought I would bust, I had seen clowns and jugglers and listened to bands, and for a moment I'd even stopped feeling the tug of Mr. Harzow. We came home and I ate dinner, and Grandma asked me if I wanted some TV time before my mom came to pick me up. I said I did, and I rushed off to tell Mr. Harzow about all the exciting things I had done and seen, and he laughed and told me how much fun it all sounded like. As he spoke, I remember yawning as his pleasant voice drifted over me, and when I felt my face drifting towards the carpet, I don't even think I was aware I was going to sleep. When I woke up in my bed the next morning, I was confused. When I couldn't find my videotape in my bag before school, I was frantic. I thought about it the whole way to school and decided that I must have left it at Grandma's house. I had fallen asleep in front of the little TV in the guest room, and so the tape must still be there. I figured it wouldn't be a problem. Grandma was going to come pick me up after school, so I could get it while I was there. When my mom picked me up instead, I was a little bit confused. "Sorry, sweetie, but Grandma's sick, so she can't take you today." Mom had taken off work for the afternoon to pick me up, and I spent the afternoon walking around the house like a junkie. I hadn't been without my tape for the last few years, so being without it now was like torture. I tried to go out and play, but I just couldn't get interested in any of the games. I tried to watch TV, but none of my favorite shows seemed to hold my attention. I just walked around aimlessly, wanting to talk to Mr. Harzow. I'd had a pretty good day that day. He would want to hear about it. He would want to hear about how my team had won at dodgeball, about how my sculpture had been praised by the teacher in art class, about how I'd made a new friend. Not being able to tell him was torture, but I knew I had to stay strong. Grandma would be better tomorrow. I just knew it. It turned out Grandma was sick that whole week, though. By the end of that week, I was becoming a mess. My parents just saw it as me being a hyperactive kid, but I felt like I was actually going through withdrawals. Sometimes I would just lie on the floor, knees tucked to my chest, and hyperventilate. I remember vividly the feeling of my breath as it rushed out and rasped wetly against my skin. I remember feeling like I might vomit, but being unable to bring up anything. I remember my dad finally taking me and putting me in my room one Saturday, because I had done nothing for 3 hours but stare at the ceiling and shudder. This will sound dramatic to you as you sit in your nice warm house. You'll think I was just overreacting or being a spoiled child who couldn't get their way. Some of you, though, the ones who have loved something self-destructive and lived through it, might understand what it was like. After a week, I asked my mom if maybe we could go visit Grandma. I told my mom I was worried about her and wanted to see her. We were driving back from school, Grandma having been sick all week, and the idea suddenly occurred to me that maybe we could go check on her. Anything at this point to get my fix. Mom had knocked about 20 times when she finally used the spare key to open the lock and head inside. I was in as soon as the gap in the door was big enough. The house looked different, but I hardly noticed. I was charging down the hall to the guest room, Mom calling for my grandmother as she came inside behind me. The door to the little guest room was ajar, and I crashed through it and knelt before the silent altar of that cold little TV on the floor. I pushed the button, but nothing happened. I pushed it again, but still nothing happened. I peeked into the VCR slot and found it empty. Someone had taken my tape. I came hobbling from the room on all fours, probably possessed of that "give us the precious" look old Smeagol showed to Frodo far too often. I heard Mom in the kitchen, still looking for my grandma, but I only had one thing on my mind. Mr. Harzow had to be here somewhere. At the bottom of the stairs, I stopped, cocking my head like a dog as I listened. I could hear him. I could hear Mr. Harzow. I could hear the melodic sound of his voice. I could hear the soothing tones that had so often told me that everything would be fine. I had craved that voice for the past 7 days, and now it was so close I could almost taste it. I ambled up the stairs as quiet as I could, pressing my ear to the door of my grandma's room. I could hear him telling her how he understood her woes and commiserated with her sorrow. I shoved the door open, looking into the squalor that had become my grandmother's room. It was filthy. A smell like waste just left to drop where it would assaulted my nose, along with the smell of spoiled food. Grandma was perched on the bed like a gargoyle, her eyes glued to the little TV on the nightstand. The glow from it illuminated her face like a death mask. It had only been a week, but she looked so haggard and so old that it almost scared me to look at her. She jumped when I screamed at her to give me back my tape. She covered the TV, the screen making her eyes shine with lust as the two of us yelled at each other like angry cats. I told her how unfair it was that she could just take things from me and demanded that she give it back. She said it was her tape now and that she would never give it back. In the background, I could also hear the consoling voice of Mr. Harzow as he told us to both find a compromise and that fighting was never the answer. I could hear Mom downstairs, her feet pounding up the hardwood, the sound of us fighting having galvanized her. Mom walked in just as Grandma dealt me a vicious slap across the cheek, rocking my head to the side and sending me sprawling to the floor. I can remember the two of them shouting at each other as easily as I can remember my favorite television show. They never came to blows, but it was very close a few times. Mom wanted to know just what the hell was going on. Grandma kept shrieking that she wanted us out, all the while clutching her murky television set. She said we were not welcome here anymore. She said she never wanted to see us again. She said that she would call the police if we didn't leave immediately. All the while, I could hear Mr. Harzow whispering for her not to do such a thing, for her to work out her problems, to reconcile with her loved ones. Far from making her see reason, hearing her voice only seemed to harden her resolve. Hearing his voice only made me want to bask in the glow of that murky television set all the more. Finally, we left, my mother weeping openly as she dragged me kicking and screaming down the stairs. That was the last time I heard his voice. For 12 years. You would say that after 12 years I might have forgotten about Mr. Harzow. You might think that after 12 years I would have surely moved on with my life. You might assume that I would find other hobbies and interests besides talking to a man that lives inside a VHS tape. You would be wrong. Dead wrong. When it became apparent that I couldn't get the tape back, I started searching. This was the early days of the internet, and I started furiously pursuing information online about similar tapes or similar programs. I didn't find much. There were a handful of people who were clearly just playing around, a few others who were trying to use the tape, and my obvious desire for it, to lure me into something terrible. Neither of these bothered me much, but the others showed me something I didn't want to see. Becky and Steven were two users I spoke to on a forum who believed they had actually come into contact with Mr. Harzow. Both had the kind of conversations with me that smack addicts likely had with each other. They spoke of their time with him lovingly, their words painting a picture of almost worshipful need. Becky said she had spent 10 years with Mr. Harzow before her mother had taken her television and thrown it out. She locked Becky in her room, and Becky had been forced to watch the truck come and take the TV, VHS and all away forever. Steven had a similar story, but his tape had been destroyed in a fire when his house had burned to the ground. That was 2 years ago when I found them, and I had no idea how much they would affect my search. About a year after meeting Steven, he stopped talking altogether. Becky and I assumed that something must have happened to him. He had been teetering lately, rolling in the memories of his time with Mr. Harzow like a dog rolling in a smell it likes, and he had been talking about self-harm a lot. When he didn't sign on for about a week, Becky and I assumed he had finally had enough of dwelling on something that he couldn't have. His last message read, "I'll be with him soon." Becky, on the other hand, saw an opportunity that I never would have foreseen. She had been asking a lot of very loaded questions about where I lived, and more importantly, where my grandmother lived. You see, Grandma was still alive, even after 12 years of living under Mr. Harzow's watchful eye. No one had seen her, no one had heard from her, and she just sort of lived off her retirement and her slowly deteriorating house. I had walked by a few times, trying to find a way inside while she was away, but she never left. Her groceries were delivered, Her mail spilled from her box, and she simply existed inside her crumbling tomb. I saw what Becky was after, and refused to tell her where she could find my tape. Becky, it seems, was more resourceful than I had thought, though. About a week ago, Mom got a call that Grandma had died. The police told us that someone had broken into her house, probably thinking it was abandoned, and found her in her bedroom. The two had fought, and despite her age, Grandma had strangled them to death. Her heart, however, wasn't quite as strong as her hands, and she had died with her fingers pressed into the flesh of the intruder. The intruder had been identified as Rebecca Smythe, a resident of California, who seemed to have driven 800 miles just to break into my grandmother's house. It seemed that my internet friend had finally pinpointed where my grandmother lived, and it had been the end of her. The night after the funeral, I made my move. I broke a window around back, we no longer had a key to the house, and made my way through the unfamiliar squalor. The house was a wreck, junk and garbage piled everywhere, and when I finally found the stairs, I breathed a sigh of relief. They were sagging, the wood groaning as I walked up them, but they were still intact, and my prize was within reach. The TV was on the nightstand, its soft glow illuminating the bed where Grandma had breathed her last. The tape sat in the murky light, like a red invitation or a jolly splash of blood. I've been holding it, feeling its red plastic in my fingers for nearly an hour, as I contemplate whether or not to slide it in. It's not a question of whether I will or not. I have missed Mr. Harzow desperately for the last 12 years, but I wanted to take down this story before I give my life back to him. You may think this is his fault somehow, but I cannot blame him for what has happened. He told my grandma on that long ago day to reconcile with us. He never told me to hurt anyone. He never told me to be unkind to anyone. I think that's why people seek him. When Mr. Harzow speaks, you feel as though he speaks only for you. He accepts you, no matter what, and that kind of power is intoxicating. The TV accepted the tape in just the same way it always had, and now he's smiling at me and welcoming me back as an old friend. I think I'll go speak with my old friend for a while. I think I'll go speak with him for the rest of my life.
The job wasn't fancy, but it would pay the bills, and that was what I needed right then. I'd graduated high school a few years ago, and no sooner had I thought about entering the job market than COVID hit and shut a lot of the world down. Suddenly, most of the things I would be qualified to do would make me a non-essential worker, so I decided to make my mom happy by going to college. She wanted me to take the time and get a degree or a certificate or something, but after 2 years and 2 changes of major, I had very little to show for my efforts. My counselor, after scowling at my file for a few minutes, finally sighed and said something to me that I'll never forget. Some people do well in school. To some people, this is a chance to engage with peers and better themselves, but this isn't the case for everyone. I feel like you may be trying too hard to be something that someone else wants you to be. Why not go out and live a little? Come back when you decide what you might like to be. Mom didn't much care for that answer, and she said if I was planning to drop out of school, then I would need to help with the bills. Dad was retired, and Mom was getting ready to retire. The last thing they wanted was another useless mouth to feed. So, started looking for a job, but the list of potential positions wasn't very long. I didn't want to flip burgers or wash cars or something I'd have to fight high school kids for, but I didn't have the skills for anything like maintenance work or coding. I didn't have the job experience for anything that wasn't entry level, and when they asked if I'd be willing to work nights, I said I would. When the site I was using sent me a list of potential jobs, I grimaced at the 6 names. Not a lot of options, but I suppose there had to be something there. There were 2 fast food jobs, so they went out. There was a part-time janitor position, but I was looking for something full-time. That left a job with a cab company, a bagger at Publix, and an assembly line job for Braxton Moore. That one surprised me because you didn't often see entry-level positions open there. Braxton Moore was an air conditioner company, one of the biggest ones in the region, and it was a place where people usually stayed for quite some time. I was in for a further surprise when I read the hours. Shift is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Candidates will need to be able to stand for 3+ hours, be required to work with a particular instruction and minimal breaks, and will not be allowed to leave for the entirety of the shift. Benefits will be from day one, and pay will be very competitive. Looking at the projected pay rate, I saw it was very competitive. That made up my mind. I sent the message to the recruiter, and about an hour later, I had an interview the next day. So that's how I came to be sitting in the offices of Braxton Moore Industrial at 11:30, listening to how I could find fulfillment as an assembly line worker. The work isn't glamorous, but the demand for products has become so great that BMU has decided to open up the facility to offer a night shift position. You'll arrive at 9:30, be at your station at 10, work till the bell rings at 6 a.m. You'll be given 2 30-minute breaks, one at 1 and one at 4. And you'll be expected to be at your station at all times. Understand? I nodded, telling him it sounded pretty cut and dry, and he chuckled as he said it was as easy or as hard as I decided to make it. There is one important thing you should know about the job before you take it. The owner, Mr. Moore, likes to keep the lights off after the second shift leaves. There are lights at the station, but the floor lights are cut off at 10 as a cost-saving measure. You aren't afraid of the dark, are you? He asked, making it sound like a joke. I told him I wasn't, and he seemed to like that. I answered a few more questions, and the interviewer seemed impressed. He shook my hand and told me to expect a call back. But a week later, I was milling around the break room as I waited for the others to arrive. A few others showed up, maybe 5 or 6, and it looked as if they were keeping the crew small. When a lady in a pantsuit arrived for orientation, I expected her to comment that it had been a slow hiring cycle. But no, she said it looked like everyone was there and told us to have a seat so we could get started. You will be part of our new night line. You will be placed at a station, and it will be your job to assemble the products as diagrammed. Your station has its own purpose, and as posted, you will be working in 3-hour shifts between breaks. When you're at your station, I must ask that you not leave. The floor is dark, due to the lights being on timers, and you could get hurt if you wander onto the manufacturing floor. What if we have an emergency or something? Asked a girl a row ahead of me. There's a phone at your workstation, but we do ask that you leave your cell phones in the lockers. Here, she said, indicating the locker at the back of the room. Locks will be provided, but if you want your own, we understand that too. I must impress upon you the importance of not leaving your workstation. It's very dark on the work floor, and you could get hurt or killed if you go exploring on your own, I mean. We went over a few things, mostly the general idea of AC manufacture, but that line kept sticking in my head. Was the machinery on while the lights were off? The cost-saving measure had to be negligible when compared to the cost of running the machines. Wouldn't it make more sense to just shut down at night? I was still thinking about it as they led us out to the floor and showed us the stations. They were little plexiglass booths with an open back, and the conveyor belt would send the parts you needed to your station for assembly. It was pretty straightforward, and I could see diagrams at each station that showed you how your pieces snapped in and how each station did its part. The second shifters were kind enough to show us what each station did, telling us that each one was pretty much the same in the long run. I found myself hanging out around Station 4 for the most part, and when the bell rang at 10, I stepped inside and figured I'd stay here. The guy who had been showing me the ropes, his hand-stitched name tag reading Russ, shook my hand in passing, wishing me luck on my first night. Something was stuck to my palm when he left, but he walked off too fast for me to call out to him. Then suddenly, the others were scrambling to get to their positions, and we were getting ready to start our first night. They kept the belt running pretty slow that first night, but just as some of us started getting the hang of it, the lights went out with a resounding chunk, and we were left in individual pools cast by the safety lights over our workstation. Some of them yelled in surprise when the noise came, but I was kind of expecting it. The lights actually went out at 11 p.m., I made a note, and wouldn't come on till 6 a.m. 7 hours of working in the dark. What fun. "Don't be alarmed," came a voice over the PA. "You were told that the lights would be going off. Continue to work and everything will be fine." There was some nervous chit-chat between stations, but they all pretty well went back to work. We had probably assembled about
8 or 9 air conditioners by the time 1 a.m. came, and when someone with a flashlight made a noise behind me, I jumped a little. "Break time," said a pudgy security guy with a bright light. He and another guy led us all to the break room so we could stretch our legs and get a snack. And as we ate our crackers and drank sodas, we got to know our fellow line workers a little. There were 3 girls, Maria, Lisa, and Tracy, and Kenny, a haggard-looking guy in his mid-40s, and Lewis, who was around my age. Kenny and Lewis and I sat together as we discussed what had brought us to this point in our lives. Kenny had been laid off along with the rest of the paper mill in the next town over, and Lewis had been part of a tech startup that had fallen hard. Both of them had suddenly found themselves unemployed and looking for something to pay bills with, which had led them here. "I tell you, though," Kenny said, his voice sounding spooky as it graveled out, "I can't wait to get back to the middle or day shift. Working in the dark is downright spooky. I could swear something was looking at me the whole time I was working out there." Kenny had taken the first booth, having the most experience with assembly line work, and he had the most floor space available behind him. From the 4th booth, I really couldn't see much with all the shadowy machinery behind me, but I imagined Kenneth, or whoever had taken a spot number 2, would have a front row seat for every clank and grind of the gears and bits. "Might be good to invest in some ear protection," I joked, but Kenneth just shook his head. "Nah, I don't reckon I'd feel any better if I couldn't hear anything. Beneath all them moving bits, it's almost like I can hear something moving out there. Like something with claws scrabbling on the ground. You guys hear anything like that? Like a weird noise under the machinery?" Both Lewis and I shook our heads, and Kenny got a weird look on his face as he looked into the mouth of his soda can. "It's like rats or something, I don't know. It's hard to be out there with so little light, is all I'm saying." They took us back on the floor not long after that, but what Kenny had said must have stuck in my head. I found myself listening for the scuttling as I worked. The work was honestly a little mindless. AC units are like high-end computers, at least the ones we were making, and the process was kind of idiot-proof. As long as you were paying attention and the damn unit was facing in the right direction on the belt, you were pretty much assured to put it where it needed to be. The units were coming in a little quicker now, and when the box of parts I had ran empty, I pushed the button next to the station to stop the line so I could get another box of parts. After a while, I would push the green button when I had 10 left so the line wouldn't stop because of me. The line still stopped sometimes, but I knew that if I could be as efficient as possible, it would go farther to getting on the day shift. I had hit the button at about 3 a.m., my belly really looking forward to that next break at 4, when the line stopped altogether and someone down the way dropped their box of parts loudly. I heard parts and pieces scatter, the worker apologizing to the guard who had brought it to her, and as the sound of the line died down again, I looked into the gloom of the factory and thought I heard something out there. There was definitely the clang of metal and the whir of moving parts, but there was something else out there too. A smaller sound, a skittering sound, and as I fixed on it, I saw something else, a pair of coal red eyes that looked at me through the gloom. We locked eyes for a moment, whatever possessed those eyes very interested in my attention, but when the little bell went off to signify the line was going again, I turned back to get my parts in before it moved on. I glanced over my shoulder again, looking for the source of the eyes, but they were already gone. By 5:30, the light was coming in through the window, and when 6 a.m. hit, the lights came on just as loudly as they had gone off, signaling the end of the work night. We filed out as the day shift filed in, and the lady in the pantsuit from orientation told us we had built about 60 units last night. The general expectation is 300 in a 24-hour period, but that was a full line. You should be very proud of your efforts, but tonight, your target will be 100 units, since you know what you're doing now. Lewis and I walked out talking, Kenneth saying he had parked out front and going the other way, and as I climbed into my car and headed home, I was actually looking forward to hitting the line again tonight. It wasn't hard work, just tedious, and it was honestly kind of nice to have something easy to do. I knew the pressure would be on tonight to make more and keep the line moving, but I felt sure that we could manage it. I had already forgotten about the weird eyes as I pulled into the front yard and headed up the stairs to sleep, but when I put my hand in my pocket, I remembered the scrap of paper that Russ had handed me the night before. Wasn't sure what I expected, but it wasn't the scrawl that was written on the little paper square. 1. If you hear scraping from the dark, don't turn around. 2. If you smell death or rotten meat, don't look and don't stop working. 3. This one's the most important. If you see the eyes looking at you, look away as fast as possible. I looked over the note a few times, trying to decide if it was a trick or something. It would be up some of these guys' alley to try to run a goof on the new guy, and I figured maybe that was what this was. Russ had seemed pretty well put together. Normal, I mean, but I guess this might be just something people did around here. I drifted off, thinking about those eyes, thinking about how maybe the line had saved me from something terrible. But what? I decided I needed answers, but first, I needed sleep. I came in around 9 that night, getting there a little earlier than I meant to, and found a familiar face in the break room. Russ was nursing a Dr. Pepper and smiled as he saw me come in. "Hey, it's my replacement. How did 4 treat you last night?" He pulled out a chair at his table, inviting me to sit. "Pretty good," I said, getting my own soda as I took a seat near him. "I was wondering if you could tell me anything about this," I said as I pushed the folded note towards him. He inhaled, putting his hand over the note as he grimaced around. "I think I'd like a smoke. How about you, kid? Can I interest you in a smoke?" I didn't smoke, but I nodded anyway and followed him out to the smoking area. The night air was bracing as we stood on the veranda of the break room, Russ lighting up as he glanced around. "You get a chance to show that to anyone?" "No." "Good. Don't. Especially not anyone from management." "Why not?" "It could get me in a lot of trouble, but I hate that they don't warn the new guys about, what's out there." I asked him what was out there, and he exhaled smoke bitterly. "Before I worked the second shift, I was on the night shift. It's not brand new, as they would like people to think it is. It's been going for years. It usually operates through word of mouth or through particular agencies. They say if you exemplify yourself on nights, it's a fast track to second shift. When I called you my replacement, you see, I wasn't kidding. I'm preparing to go to day shift. The brass ring as far as anyone around here is concerned. I've earned it, though. I've done 5 years on second shift, just waiting for an opening. But I've never forgotten the nights I spent on that dark floor as I assembled AC units by the little light overhead. It was your first night, but I'll go ahead and assume you probably saw something." I wanted to deny it for some reason, but I ended up just nodding and telling him about the eyes. He nodded and kind of blew smoke out of his nose. "Yeah, the eyes. How many sets did you see?" "Just 1, I told him, not really liking the question. "Good. 1's okay. If you see 2 sets, one above the other, look away immediately. If you see 3 sets, well, it's probably already too late by then." "Too late for what?" I asked, not liking all the secrecy. "I don't know, but it's not something you want to mess with. It takes people sometimes, people who really see it or do something it doesn't like. You can hear it when it's getting close. Its claws or whatever are sharp, and I've seen the maintenance guys trying to buff them off the floor sometimes. There's a smell to it as well, like rotten garbage or old meat, but you only really smell it if it gets close. The eyes are the most important part. Don't look at it if you can help it. It doesn't like being looked at. But if you're looking and it opens its 3rd set of eyes, it's probably too late anyway. At that point, don't blink, because the second you blink, it'll get you. I heard the higher-ups were impressed with you and the guy in Spot 1. Get through your training period, and they'll likely bump one, if not both of you, up to mid-shift. Take the promotion if they do. Get off nights as fast as you can, and don't look back. It's a death trap, a trap that gets closer to killing you the longer you... The door opened then, and the woman in the pantsuit stuck her head out, smiling at Russ and I. "There you are. Everyone's ready to get going. Russ, I trust you aren't trying to scare the new guy off." Russ smirked, pitching his cigarette away as he turned to go back in. "Just showing the newbie the ropes, Miss Baker. He's got a good head on his shoulders. I want to make sure he makes it to mid-shift." "As do we all," the woman said,
smiling at Russ as he took his leave. That night was rough. We were going from the time we got there, till the accident happened at 2 a.m. The lady had told us flatly that she was giving us a goal of 100 units by 6 a.m., and she assured us that she was serious. If you are moved onto the other shifts, there will be daily goals to meet. Bonuses are given to shifts that meet their goals, but layoffs often follow the ones that don't. Don't get laid off because of dilly-dallying. By our first break of the night, we had made about 50. We all sat together that night, talking about how if we kept it up, we'd make our goal by the time the next break came around. Everyone was excited, wanting to make our goal on the second day. Wasn't as if it had never been done before, but we were excited to make it happen, nonetheless. Kenneth was quiet as we talked, though, shivering a little as he sat and munched the sandwich he'd brought for dinner. It was clear that something was on his mind, but whatever it was, he had no intention of sharing it with us. We came back at about 1:30 and set to our task. We were making good time, sending them down as quickly as we could, but that's when we heard the noise. It was different than the sound when the lights went on. This one was a lighter sound, like the buzzing just before the lights go out. I glanced up, my eyes seeing the lights overhead buzz, and then suddenly they went out. Not just mine, but all of them went out, all at once. It was like a breaker had been thrown, and the voice of the security guy came overhead and told us to calm down while they got the lights back on. I heard the chit-chat erupt further down, even the winking of an illegal cell phone as the flashlight came on, but I kept my eyes on the line. I remembered Russ telling me about the eyes and the claws, and I was afraid to look too hard into the shadows. I heard something as the machinery powered down slowly, a noise on the edge of hearing. I heard the light scamper of nails, and my spine nearly tingled. As the machines came to a halt, the clicking sounded thunderous without the noise to cover it. It was quiet, like mice feet, but sounded to me like fingernails walking across bricks. It clipped along like a whole procession of fingers, and I wondered if there was more than one. I kept my eyes forward, the clicking going past, and that's when I smelled the smell. Russ hadn't done it justice. It was like roadkill in the sun, like the piles of guts my grandpa used to leave outside the slaughterhouse after he butchered a deer. And as it moved past, the cloud settled over me. It took everything I had not to gag, and as the cloud went away, I heard others comment on it. When someone further down the row screamed, I turned in time to see the lights come back on and see Lisa pressed against the wall of her workstation, hyperventilating. The security guys came in a hurry as her screams peeled up towards the ceiling, and the assembly line ground to a halt once again. After some quiet talk, Lisa was escorted off the floor, and we had to figure out how to continue without her. Tracy agreed to work both stations, but Tracy hadn't been fast to start with, and our productivity slowed and lost momentum. We managed another 30 in this way, Tracy and Lewis swapping out from time to time, and we ended our night with about 80 units. The woman seemed pleased that we had made it so close after losing a person, but when I saw Lisa in the parking lot after I got out, I realized I wanted to know what had set her off. Had she been sitting out here for the last 4 hours? Did she not have a car of her own? "You okay?" I asked, coming to sit beside her at the bus stop. She nodded, sniffling a little as she looked at her shoes. I don't think I'm coming back tonight." "Why?" I asked. We had never been close. I don't think I'd ever actually spoken to her before now, but she seemed willing to talk as we sat on the cold bench by the bus stop. I had my phone out, using the light. I knew I shouldn't, but I took it on the floor. I turned around, wanting to take a picture to post later, just a joke post. But when I snapped the picture, I found something else. It was shadowy. I couldn't see it very well, but it was terrible, she said with a shudder. It was like a scuttling tumor with too many teeth. Its eyes were like little pits, devoid of life. I don't know what I saw, but it made me feel like I was a little girl again, listening to the monsters under my bed.
I offered to take her home, but she said she would rather just wait on the bus. I sat with her until it got there, and that night, Lisa wasn't there. There was someone new waiting for us, a young kid who looked fresh out of high school, and we welcomed Nick onto the assembly line. He took up Lisa's old spot, bopping his head as he listened to music at his station, and was never bothered by the problems that Kenneth and I seemed to be plagued by. I forgot to mention that Lisa wasn't the only casualty of the night shift, it seemed. Kenneth didn't stop coming to work. He had bills to pay and people depending on him, but he just got more and more haggard looking as the week went on. He clearly wasn't sleeping, and he seemed anxious every time he had to return to the floor after breaks or at the start of shift. This went on till Wednesday of our third week. It went on until Kenneth snapped. It was another night of working the assembly line, making AC units as fast as we possibly could. We were easily meeting our 100 units a night goal and had even completed 125 a few times. The higher-ups were impressed with their new prospects, but the word was that Kenneth and I were the standouts. The talk was that at the end of the first month, Braxton Moore was planning to extend jobs to the standouts on the floor, and my name was on the list next to Kenneth's. If he had just held out for another couple of days, Kenneth would have been free of the demons that haunted his night. It was about 3:30 in the morning, and the noises had been worse than usual. The skittering had gone back and forth since 8 o'clock, and the smell had been something constant. Security had claimed there was a dead raccoon in the vents or something, but I think most of us suspected it was something else. More than a few of them had noticed the smell, if not the clicking nails, and the eyes that sometimes found you were hard to ignore. We were all doing our best to ignore it when Kenneth suddenly loosed a primal scream and made us all jump. "Go away! I'm sick of this! I'm sick of all of this! I'm gonna kill you!" he yelled, fists balled as he stalked into the darkness. He ran off into the gloom, and before I could think better of it, I went after him. Lewis and Kenneth had become something like friends to me in the last few weeks, and I couldn't let Kenneth go off and get himself killed. I ran after him, the dark closing around me, but I had stumbled about 50 feet on the floor and hit my head on something as I went down hard. I lost a couple of minutes, but I realized how much I had nearly lost when my vision cleared. There were 2 sets of open eyes hovering over me, and the third had just slid open. The creature towered over me, standing on a body covered in long, twitching fingers, grinning down at me with a mouthful of needle-sharp teeth. His body was lumpy like a giant potato, but his teeth were just as sharp as Lisa had said. His eyes were burning pits with smoldering coals, all of them staring at me as I lay on my back, my head throbbing. I nearly lost before it even started, but I remembered before the pain could force a wincing blink out of me. I held the creature's nightmare gaze, the eyes smoldering into me like hot coals, and I could feel it regarding me as its heat dried my corneas. I had always been pretty good at staring contests when I was a kid, but this one took the cake. It probably made a difference that my life was on the line, but in a lot of ways, this was just another bully trying to stare me down. Nothing mattered at that moment. Not Kenneth, not the job, nothing but beating this thing and proving it could be done. If I lost, then I'd never know it. If I won, however, I'd be the only one who would know, since no one would believe me. It felt like we stared at each other for hours, but when all 3 sets of eyes finally blinked, I breathed in a sigh of relief. It clicked away on those nubby legs, the ends likely tipped in claws or something, and when I saw flashlights and heard people calling my name, I started backpedaling towards them. The security guys were as relieved to see me as I was to see them, and they helped me to the break room to get the little gash on my head seen about. They told me to take it easy for a while, and I was glad for an excuse to breathe. After what I had just been through, a little break was the best I could hope for before having to suck it up and go back to the floor. The woman in the pantsuit came in half an hour later, and after finding everyone in the break room, told us to go home for the night. They still hadn't found Kenneth, and didn't sound like they expected to. She asked me to stop before I could leave, calling me into a nearby office before handing me a manila envelope. Inside was an offer for the second shift, something I'd been expecting to see. The higher-ups are impressed with your work, and except for leaving your post tonight to try to get Kenneth, they were impressed with your ability to follow expressed rules. They want to offer you a spot on the mid-shift, if you want it. That was about a year ago, and I've been working mids ever since. The shift is as different as, well, as night and day, not to sound too cliche. With the floor lit up, it's easy to see all the things that looked scary in the dark and sort out all the moving parts as just machinery or belts or something else. I haven't heard the clicking or smelled the smell since starting on mids, but sometimes I still see those eyes. It isn't anything consistent, but it's more often than I would like. Sometimes if you look up into the mouth of the industrial fans near the ceiling, just before shift change, you can see a glowing pair of eyes just waiting for the lights to go out. It fears the lights for some reason, and it won't come onto the floor until the lights are off and the night shifts are bathed in the protective bubbles. I won't work nights anymore, and no one has asked, but every time I think about picking up a night shift for some extra cash, I think about those eyes and decide differently. Lewis is coming to mids next week, his rise taking a bit longer than mine, and he seems glad. It's nice being out of the darkness and the overbearing interests of the night overseer who scuttles and watches eternally.